So if you're looking for family drama in your military fantasy, you've come to the right place. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about a book, and not just any book, but Water Sleeps. It's been a while. Yeah, Water Sleeps by Glen Cook, the 8th book in the main sequence of the Chronicles of the Black Company, and it's been a while. So before we move any further, if I'm repeating stuff that I said in She is the Darkness, it's because it's been like 2 years since you made that video, I think. And since it caused me almost physical pain to rewatch older videos of mine, I have not rewatched it. I assume that I roughly know what I did back then. So I apologize for that if you're just watching all of these videos in one go. That's not the goal here. So, with that said, let's do the thing that I usually do when I talk about books. I'll give you a quick synopsis, spoiler-free as much as possible, and then we'll go into details of what I take away from rereading Water Sleeps now for the 5th time or whatever, how many times it has been. And, yeah, maybe you'll learn something, maybe you disagree with me. That's kind of the goal here. Once again, the synopsis will be very, very quick because, yeah, it's the 8th book in a series, and I assume at this point you don't need a review. You've probably already read it and just want to talk about it. And, yeah, you should read it. If you've read this far, if you've come this far, you want to keep on going until the end, so that's that. So let's start. Synopsis. This moves on right after She is the Darkness, which had the killer ending of the main part of the Black Company, you know, Croker, Lady, Mergen, that gang, everyone being captured under the fortress of on the plain of glittering stone, and yeah, almost everyone being betrayed by Soulcatcher and Willow Swan. And the question was, like, how many people are still around to do anything at this point? And yeah, that's the ending there. So, when we start this one, Water Sleeps, we are faced with the resistance against Soulcatcher, and ideally the plan to free the people that are captured under Glittering Stone if they are still alive. So the first questions that we need to ask ourselves is, like, who's going to tell this story? And the answer is Sleepy, who you may remember as someone picked up during the siege of Dejagore or Jaipur, or you know, any of the many other names this city has. And Sleepy was a character in the in Bleak Seasons mostly, and in She is the Darkness, which ended with the revelation that Sleepy was in fact not a man, as we all thought until then, but a woman, at least physically. Now the question is, where does that go with, like, gender stuff and so forth? We'll talk about that in a moment. Anyway, Sleepy is the new analyst. Possibly Sleepy is also the captain, or at least the current sort of leader, a military leader of the Black Company. There is, however, another part in the Black Company that is doing stuff, and that is Sarah, wife of Mergen, and her son, well, their son, Tobo, who was born near the end of She is the Darkness, and Sarah moved back to Taglias and is the other person at the core of the underground resistance against Soulcatcher and so forth. The book then follows their exploits in Taglias and their attempts of freeing the buried members. It also starts like 15 years after the events of She is the Darkness, so there's a bit of a time gap here, which allows, you know, people like Tobo to grow up long enough to be at least a character that you can play with as a writer, and it also means that a lot of the other people that are not under the plane of Glittering Stone are probably very, very old. And we'll talk about all of these things now. So basically, this is a very different book from the last one, which had, like, all these large-scale battles and huge, you know, well, more military actions. This one is far more about underground fighting, urban guerrilla stuff, resistance, and these kind of things, with obviously a new voice. And we'll talk about all of that now, because this is the synopsis. If you haven't read the book yet, go read it. It's really good. I really like it, but then again, I like the entire series, and I think all of these books are brilliant. So let's go and talk about things in detail. So from here on out, there will be spoilers. And let's start with the first part. Sleepy, as an analyst, a narrator. I've spoken about it before, the way that Glen Cook is able to switch style from first-person narrator, from analyst to analyst, the way you have Crocker in his, like, very sort of dark humor, then you have Lady in her very somewhat self-congratulatory and very self-assertive way of writing in Dreams of Steel, and then you have Mergen in his more long-winded way in both She Is the Darkness and, of course, in Bleak Seasons. So how is Sleepy going to be? I think Sleepy is interesting as a character because Sleepy might be the first. I think Sleepy is the first religious character. Now, we ever since we started talking about Taglias, religion has become a major focus of the series. So having a narrator that is actually following the at least one of the different religions that show up in this area is obviously interesting, because how do you square your religion with the fact that maybe Kina is out there as a goddess? How do you do all of these things? And that I think is one of the sort of interesting aspects here, that, Sleepy doesn't curse. Glen Cook has no problem with using swear words of any way, shape, or form in dialogue. When Sleepy writes about something, Sleepy uses heck instead of hell and stuff like that, which I found interesting, just as, how to signal that we're talking about a different person here. And I really, really found it all very well done. We also have, other aspects here. Sleepy clearly being in love with knowledge as an idea. We have one of Sleepy's disguises being a sweeper at a library and reading and studying, and the idea that Sleepy is very much in love with books is part of this. The other part is, of course, Sleepy's gender, the way Sleepy's gender is portrayed, and, of course, Sleepy's trauma. Because we already knew that from, like, earlier. I think it got mentioned either already in Bleak Seasons, or at latest in She Is the Darkness, that Sleepy clearly got abused in multiple ways, probably very much sexual ways, as a child by family members whom Big Bucket killed and saved Sleepy, and Sleepy then enlisted as a relatively young boy in the Black Company during that siege, and has become, the assistant analyst at the end of She Is the Darkness, and is now the captain. Now, obviously, everyone in the Black Company knows now that Sleepy is a woman. Possibly. And this is very interesting. I think the way Glen Cook deals with that is very interesting, because you have people like One Eye making a lot of, like, sexist remarks about Sleepy in all kinds of ways, and they are absolutely horrifying. But then once again, I think this is the strength of the Black Company, is like it very clearly portrays the kind of environment that, a mercenary or military is, with all the sexism, with all the misogyny that is kind of built into those kind of things. Even characters that are assumed to be, the good guys, so to speak, as much as you can be a good guy within a mercenary outfit. Even those people being very casually sexist and so forth. While at the same time, because we have Sleepy's internal monologue from time to time, we know that Sleepy is very clearly dealing with this trauma. We never get, like, any clear detailed explanation of the abuse that Sleepy suffered back in Jaipur. We get nothing of that. It is usually talked about as, just like trauma, the darkness, and situations where Sleepy just goes away mentally and shuts off. Now, we can talk about how accurate all of this is, but this book is now 25 years old. This was written in 1999. So the portrayal of trauma, sort of almost neurodivergent like style behaviors or mental health issues that are the result of dealing with of PTSD in this case, basically. That portrayal, I think, is done fairly sensitively. Like, this is not bad in the way that we have, like, the when Sleepy goes like then I go away and focus on something else, and Sleepy is able to pin on very specific things, and like almost over focus in the way that someone with say ADHD might hyperfocus, but how to use those activities like hyperfocus as a defense mechanism to deal with that trauma. I think the way Glen Cook handles that, and the way that there is a revulsion towards all things sexual, how Sleepy as a character is, I guess you would probably call Sleepy asexual or somewhere in the asexual spectrum today. Obviously, those are vocabularies that that Glen Cook didn't know in 1999, so you have to sort of like look at how this works in its specific content. From like in the year 2024, I would say there's certainly room for improvement, but it has aged surprisingly well for something that is at its core still military fantasy. So we have someone who is religious and has to square their specific form of religion with both like with a lot of stuff that is very clearly against any tenets of their religion, like the Vedna in this case, Vedna religion, I think, is sort of similar, closer to Islam than a lot of other like of these fictionalized religions, with the Guni cult being clearly Hindu, and the Shadar, I suspect they're supposed to be closer to Sikh. I don't know much about Sikh, so I'm sorry about that. So having to sort of come to terms with that, and still sort of finding, like in the ritual of belief and so forth, finding in that also like ways of dealing with the trauma, with the PTSD and so forth. I think Cook does that fairly well, and I think that's one of the strengths of the Black Company, is that something that is at its core a military fantasy, if not the military fantasy series, where it is all about military stuff. It manages to pack in so much like social interactions, just human family relations, all of these human things that are what make any group of humans interesting. And yes, we had a lot of like large-scale military stuff going on in She is the Darkness, but this time it's much more focused on the humans, which is, I think, the next part I wanted to talk about. Because I think there is something interesting. I want to come back to that when we talk about Soldiers Live. There's something interesting going on with Water Sleeps, and that is it mirrors, in a way, the series is sort of like almost mirrored, because if there's one book in the entire series that I think it's the closest to in style, or not necessarily in style, but like in subject matter and themes and so forth, it is at its core Shadows Linger, the second book, and this is the penultimate one of the series. So we're going back in time when it comes to these things, because if you remember, Shadows Lingers this way around. The Black Company is sort of like in this is occupying the town of Juniper, and you have the perspective of the people fighting against these occupiers, or at least in the buskin down there. And on the other hand, you have our like viewpoint character that is not Shed, like mostly like Croker stuff and so forth, being the oppressors in that very specific situation. Whereas this time around, we are once again in an urban environment that is under military rule. In this case, Mugaba and Soulcatch guards, basically being the oppressing force here, and we have the Black Company, or the remainders of the Black Company, being the guerrillas, being the resistance in a lot of ways. So it kind of mirrors Shadows Linger, and I think that is very clearly on purpose by Glen Cook, because these later books in the series have a lot of like metafictional aspects to it that one of these, I think, is shown by this sort of mirroring there. Now the question is, what do you do with that? And I think while we have spy technology, like spycraft and a lot of like disguises and doing abductions, like urban fighting, urban guerrilla stuff mostly, the key point is the utter helplessness that a small group in such a situation, such a resistance group, faces, and how that kind of turns this group inwards and makes them even more reliant on each other, and more tight-knit in a lot of ways, almost as if they were in like a pressure cooker. And you can tell that with a lot of the stuff that is going on, the sort of conflicts between people like Sleepy and Sarah on the one hand, and with Sarah and Tobo on the other hand, and with One Eye and Goblin, obviously. All of these sort of elements, those ideas of stress that are the result of being constantly on the lookout and being constantly hunted, I think, is something that is interesting to see from the first-person perspective this time around, where we saw it from a third-person perspective with Shed and the stuff in the Buskin down in Shadows Linger. So that, I think, is an important aspect to this. Now, obviously, there is a lot of, interesting spycraft stuff going on. There are some further hints at, the librarian thinking that Sleepy, who is disguised as a young boy in this regard, clearly having some sexual thoughts there that may or may not be consensual. I mean, obviously they never end anywhere, so we can't really talk about consent. But there's certainly an interest there of a form of homosexuality there. I would say it's not handled too well, but it's not handled too homophobically either, because clearly what is Master Santaraxita is obviously a good guy. It's just interesting to have these sort of elements here and see how these have changed over the last 25 years. But let's talk about strengths. And I think there are two main things here that I find interesting. One is the situation with Sarah and Tobo, and how Glen Cook writes about the sort of conflicts that come up with a adolescent boy under the, having to deal with his mother, who is also very much in charge of large parts of the general outfit that they're that he's running with, and how there's issues of trust on both sides, and how there's on the one hand an idea of Sarah being unable to let go or give Tobo any of his freedoms because she has already lost a lot of people, and on the other hand him chafing against those restrictions, which on the other hand are there for a reason, because there is a lot of actual deadly pressure, deadly danger out there for Tobo. So I found that just interesting, because as I if you want family drama in a military fantasy, this is what you get here. There's a lot of family drama in there, in that specific version, obviously with Mergen being an absent father by being under a rock, literally. And what is interesting there is, a lot of families with military people, part of the military, you have exactly that situation, even if your father or mother is deployed in a different country, actively fighting or whatever. You grow up without that person, and you only have a very tenuous relationship to them. They can write back, they can call. Now, obviously, you can have way more technology stuff nowadays and call more up to a point, but this situation is very much something that is real, and once again speaks to a military or to the experience of being connected to the military in some way or form as a family. And I find that interesting, the way Cook manages to take this very modern situation and turn it into a fantasy topic, and I found that very interesting. The other part is, of course, the found family trope, in a way. I mean, technically, the Black Company has always been described as a family, and it's clearly the found family of Sleepy, who got basically adopted by Big Bucket in the past, and has sort of grown into the family. And the way the relations within the core group of Goblin, One Eye, Sarah, Sleepy, and the few other people that are still around there is described is far more in terms of family than it has been in previous books, and I think it works really well in that way, and I appreciate the way Cook does that. The next part is aging. Now, a lot of fantasies about young people doing stuff, and very few older people. I mean, Aragorn is technically over 100 years old, but you never learn that until literally the end. Whereas aging and realizing that the end is coming closer and so forth is something that Glen Cook does a lot. You see that when he, as an inspiration for Malazan, where you have a lot of older people as well. But here it's very clear with Goblin and One Eye getting slower at what they do, and with Sleepy getting older, with Sarah getting older. Aging is a huge issue, and we have people just dying of natural causes, right? We have the older merchant that helped Sarah and Mergen before dying of natural causes, basically, in this situation. We later have, and this is, I think, one of the best, but also one of the darkest parts of the entire series. We have One Eye having a stroke and trying to come through that as a wizard and soldier, and yeah, there's no larger reason. It's like, yeah, this guy is really, really old. This stuff happens, and sometimes it's not really just death in battle that like gets you when you're a part of the military. It's all these other things as well. And I think this is really important, because if you have met, the kind of military fantasy and military sci-fi that is very glorious of war, glorifying war and military action, that is never happening. People die glorious in battle by saving everyone and so forth. And the meaninglessness of death and the fact that it's not tied to any specific reason or whatever is something that is important. And Glen Cook manages to make that hurt, to make that really stick and hurt and cause pain. I think Water Sleeps is probably one of the most intense in that regard, with the death of obviously at the end Goblin being one of those situations, because it's just caused by a teenager being overconfident and not dying himself, in this case Tobo, but endangering other people. And yeah, that's just like the thing that can happen. Not necessarily. It's usually not the people, or not usually, but like, just because you fuck up doesn't mean that you get to pay the price. It could also be someone else around you, and that is, something that I think works really well. Also, like the way it is plotted in this book, with it happening absolutely at the end when everyone is basically relieved, and not during all the times when they're panicking that something might go wrong when they're still in Taglia. So that I think was like really well done, and I appreciate the way Cook handles all of that. Now, let's move on to like one or two other things before we end this today. I want to come back to the idea of taking inspiration from the real world. Now, Glen Cook does that a lot, and I think it's really interesting the way he does that, both on like a metafictional way in the end when Goblin sees Kina as Sleeping Beauty, so we have like a grim fairy tales, reference joke almost in there, and there's a lot of like these metafictional things in there, right? We have him mention both A Surrender to the Will of the Night, which is a book of his the Instrumentalities of the Night series, and I think it's either in this one or in the next one, he mentions A Shadow of All Night Falling, which is part of his Dread Empire series. So he clearly has fun doing metafictional stuff in these books, and putting Sleeping Beauty in there is really interesting. It'll come up in Soldiers Live as well, but but we also, and I talked about it in some detail, I think, in the She is the Darkness, or like an earlier one. Taglias is very clearly modeled after parts of India, with having different religions vying there, with having certain practices, like having funeral ghats where widows, commit suicide when their husbands die, stuff of that sort. And I want to talk about it once again, and mostly in regard to the deceivers, because I think there's a way you can do this that can work out really well. And the deceivers are clearly modeled after the thuggy, however you pronounce it, cult that gave us in English the word thug, which was the idea of having Kali cultists basically being wandering bands of murderers and thieves. And the problem with that is that it is the image that we have of that in society, that is, came up obviously in stuff like the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom movie, and a lot of other places over the years and over the last 150 to 200 years. The problem with that is, of course, that that image was created by the British Raj in India. And while there may have been sources that led to this, the image that we have is clearly an image created by colonialism and by colonialist oppression in a lot of ways. And that's the image that Cook took. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a fantasy book, and you don't need to know anything about actual India and colonialism to read this book and enjoy it. And taking these sort of stories, because clearly they were very powerful stories because they caught on in India and England at the time, and the UK at the time, you can transplant them into a fantasy world and they work out really well. Because these are, of course, well-established narratives, and the reason they were successful as propaganda makes them successful in fiction as well. And there is, of course, the interesting question, like, so what if those beliefs are actually real? Because, it's fantasy. You can have gods in this kind of world, and that, I think, could go somewhere interesting, but, and this is what I wanted to highlight here, I wanted to contrast it with something else at the other side, which is, of course, the Raja Dharma thing and the Bodhi, which are clearly basically Buddhist self-incinerating, setting themselves on fire in protest. And now, if this sounds familiar, then that's something that, for example, mostly monks from Tibet have done in protest against the Chinese government, Chinese occupation of Tibet for the last 50, 60, I'm not good with dates right now, years. And yes, you can take that specific element as well into your fiction. As I said, there's a metafictional element to these stories, to the way Glen Cook is writing. But what is interesting here is that the Bodhi disciples are clearly sort of the good guys, because they're protesting against Soulcatcher and the military occupation and so forth. And what that kind of shows us is that it's very difficult for a writer with a Western perspective to adopt these elements and narratives and historical facts, or maybe far exaggerated historical facts, and turn them into fantasy without also kind of falling for the historical, political narratives in this regard. The fight against the Thuggee was very much the British propaganda during the British Raj. And the exaggeration, I'm not making a political statement here, but the glorification up to a point of these kind of protests against the Chinese government is something that is highlighted as positive in the Western world, or has been by anti-communist forces as well. So the sort of like the moral judgment that is inherent in these stories, in these historical facts and elements and inspirations, carries over into the fantasy world. And I think it's interesting to see that. And what he, on the one hand, kind of tells us that this is 25 years old, and there have been newer studies on, for example, the propaganda aspect of the war against the Thuggee and so forth in that time, and certainly with the advent of more, global authors from different parts of the world into the fantasy world, we have seen different evaluations and perspectives on such historical inspirations. And I think that's a good thing, and that's a very helpful thing, because it can kind of show us that even though we sort of recognize story elements from our own world, which, make fantasy replications of that much more accessible, we are hopefully in a situation nowadays where we don't just take these things at face value in the way that they may have been done 25 years ago when Water Sleeps came out. And that I think is sort of something that I didn't notice when I first read the book, and I really loved it back then. But that does sort of make me slightly uncomfortable reading it now. Don't get me wrong, I still love the book. I still think it's an absolute brilliant fantasy novel that does an incredible amount of good stuff with character work, with the way it deals with stuff like PTSD, the way it portrays the aging of people, the way it deals with like the family tensions, all of that stuff. It's all absolutely brilliant, but there are things that have changed, and it's important to kind of point that out and see where these things come from that don't necessarily age as well. And you can read it in a way as a cautionary tale when, when writing your own book, when creating your own fantasy world for, say, a tabletop role-playing game or whatever else, and a lot of us are creative in that regard. It's like, when we take these inspirations from our world and from history, and there's no better inspiration than history for, like, anything, right? There is always a danger of getting it wrong, because if we pick history, we all automatically pick the state of history, of historiography, of the point in time and our position and our place where we start writing from, right? That's just like inherent in how these things work. And that automatically dates what we do. And we have to sort of live with the fact that there may be some change in research, some change in politics, some change in the world that happens like tomorrow, like the day after we put this, send this off to the publisher, the day after we run the game at the table or whatever, that completely shifts perspectives. And that's, I guess it's something that we should live with, and we have to live with, but it's also maybe sort of a bit of a cautionary tale to give us, to be responsible when we do these things and do the best to our, the best we can do to to get stuff right. And in that regard, once again, I'm not trying to bash this book. I'm just saying, look at it and see how practices within the genre have changed over the last 25 years, hopefully to the better, and maybe just see what kind of negative elements are sort of inherent when we take just a Western perspective on places from the East. Now, once again, in the previous books, with Mergen being from, the North, and with Croker in the book before that and Lady before that, you have always had the outside perspective, and you can always go like, well, their description of Taglios is pretty racist in some regards and so forth. You can go with that, but like, Sleepy is native of that region, and Sleepy's perspective is tainted by that, I think, in some regards. So still having the world that way and not necessarily understanding or like judging within that mind frame makes it more difficult for a Western writer, I think, to get that perspective right and sort of get away with it by like, well, I'm writing a first-person narrative and my characters are obviously biased in a lot of ways, so you have to deal with that. And it's like, partly you get that with Sleepy through their religious bias that Sleepy definitely has as a Vedna, but I don't think it goes all the way, and I think it's just like something I wanted to bring up because I think it's important to notice these kind of things and recognize them when we read books or when we do something creative ourselves. But that's like the main negative thing I wanted to mention here. The rest is obviously a brilliant book, and I had a lot of fun rereading it yet again. I hope you had that fun as well. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let's have us a conversation about a brilliant book, and let's, I don't know, just appreciate the fact that we have something as marvelous as The Black Company. And I'll be back very soon when I talk about the last one of the main series, that obviously being Soldiers Live, and wonder why. And thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking with me. Like, subscribe, comment, join the Patreon if you feel like it. I'll see you very soon. And until then, thanks and cheers.